Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending from where you're tuning on. You are welcome. Welcome to another edition with Mamlakak Broadcast Network, or how we affectionately call it MBNK. Today we have a special interview for you. But prior to me to give the floor to our guests, I would like to know, where are you tuning in from? Can you please put on the comment box? Because you're going to hear something today that you will not hear it on the Lens-Free Media. So let's get started. Over the past 9 years, our world has indeed been through significant geopolitical, economic, and ideological challenges and transformation. While the battle between good and evil can be traced far back, almost possibly even in millennium, recent events have brought this struggle into a sharp focus. And today, as I said earlier, we have the honor and privilege to sit down with the one and only SG Anon, a renowned podcaster, a sought out after in the truther community for his extensive research on the operation that I call the Global Great Awakening. Equally important, I like to highlight this. In the truther community, SG is mentioned alongside individuals like Derek Johnson, Mike King, and Dylan Monroe, the creator of the Q web map. They are recognized for their effort in organizing and explaining research in a comprehensive manner. So allow me to read this quote. All the world is a stage, and all the men and women merely a player. They have their exit and their entrance, and one man in his time plays many parts. That quote is from William Shakespeare. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome one and only one, SG Anon. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me here, Veronique. It's good to be here.
Thank you. Thank you again, SG, for accepting this invitation. And I know that today we have a treat for our audience, because, as I said, it's very, very difficult for you to have an interview with people because you are in high demand. But we are so privileged to have you. And today we know that our audience, they are going to hear things that's going to be maybe for some of them the first time, and that's going to be an eye-opening, and which is why we wanted it, which is the reason why this first interview with you, SG, is of educational and awakening purpose. We do believe also that the time is now for our audience to understand and grasp the magnitude of what has been going on behind the scene. Things that, as I say, the legacy media will not inform them. So SG, the only person that can best introduce you is yourself. Can you please tell us furthermore, who is SG Anon?
I'd be happy to. SG Anon, Veronique, is, it's of course my stage name for online purposes. I use my initials in that, and the Anon reference is reference to an entity online called Q. Formerly in a life quite a long time ago, several years ago, more than a decade now at this point, Anon referenced the online group Anonymous. It was an online hackers group that I was a part of here in the United States of America. In response to an awakening process, a great awakening process, as you described a moment ago, that I ended up on in around about the year 2010. When I was in college, I would think I was around 19 years old, I discovered in a research design and proposal experiment that I was doing. It was a term paper and experiment that I was having to write out about the effects of soft drinks, Coca-Colas, PepsiCo, things like that, on the actual anatomy and the human physiology of the body, how they interacted with the cells at the cellular level, whether or not they suppressed mitochondrial function, if I remember correctly, was what the main contention of my research design and experiment was going to be all about. And in researching for that particular term paper, again at 19 years old, I discovered on the NIH.gov website, no less, a number of different articles discussing the food additive and development process, and specifically the scientific R&D that went into designing flavor profiles, essentially, right? A great deal of the food in the United States of America has been chemically designed and synthesized in a lab. It's not actually taken directly from the plant stuff, the animal stuffs that exists naturally out there in the world, sort of almost to the point that around the rest of the planet, it's almost like an understood that the United States has extremely poor health and extremely wonderful tasting food that is not good for you. But one of the additives I discovered in that particular process was something called HEK 293. This was an additive that was being used at industrial scale by both Coca-Cola and PepsiCo to heighten the sweeten addiction gradient, essentially to tantalize the taste buds alongside that particular sweet flavor profile inside of their soft drinks and inside of their produced beverages. So this wasn't limited to just straight Pepsi Cola or straight Coca-Cola. It was also included in anything that Coca-Cola and PepsiCo assisted in producing, things like Snapple, for example. And so HEK 293, for your audience out there, stands for human embryonic kidney, 293rd protein sequence derivative of the same. And it occurred to me in those days when I was 19 that we were all cannibals, and we had not any idea that we were actually doing this. This was not something that was included in informed consent. It certainly was not apparent on the ingredient label of any soft drink or cola or any beverage produced by the aforenamed companies. The research and development firm that actually isolated this particular protein sequence derivative and produced it at scale was a company called Senomyx, SENOMYX for those out there. Senomyx was later bought, I believe, in 2016 or 17 by a Swiss perfume giant. But that particular company was utilizing the bioharvested organic material of the large-scale abortion industry here in the United States to feed its biomaterial research and development operations, which were intrinsically linked with those of the food and beverage industry. So when I began to put this together and piece this together, it sent me, of course, upon my own personal awakening journey. I went through a dark night of the soul. I had a very difficult time adjusting to a great deal of that. I actually attempted to join the armed forces of the United States in my youthful ignorance, because I believed that that would be one of the channels, the most likely channel in those days for how I could make a difference stopping this regulatory evil, because it was a regulatory system that was enabled and entirely legal for the purpose of, sort of hoodwinking the American consumer into not only poor quality food, but downright evil food. I was not able to complete that enlistment process due to an injury situation that came up, but I made a couple of very good friends along the way, and one of those friends later became a mentor of mine. I met this individual through the recruiting activities initially through that process, and once that individual left the services and retired out, I believe they retired at 19 or 20 years, if I'm not mistaken, I got a wonderful extracurricular education from this person in things like cryptography, irregular warfare, code breaking, signals intelligence, essentially how to understand messaging that is not overt, that is not verbal, that is not visible to the untrained eye, but is yet still there and is being utilized to symbolically govern and establish a construct around the planet. And so that sent me, of course, on a multi-year journey into the online space. I was at the same time attempting to acclimate to a, quote unquote, traditional American family life. I went out and dated individuals in the late 2010s. I saw the birth of my, what I affectionately call my little guy. And so, moving forward through this process over the last, 15 years at this point, it's been essentially a defining developmental procession of events that became who I am. I see the world in ways that are sort of unusual. I think about things in an upside down land kind of fashion. I always err on what the hidden message is. If someone or something is presenting something to me, I want to know all facets of it, not only those that are visible or audible immediately on the surface. I like to dig in deep. I like to find background context, additional details, and really cross-reference myself with whatever it is that happens to be coming across my path. I'm one of the world's worst car shoppers, for example, because of that particular propensity to sort of view things in that lens. In 2017, the individual who I referred to as my mentor earlier and I had some fantastic conversations about this new Trump presidency that had happened that year. And then later that particular year, we saw an entity come online called Q. Now, for those that are unaware, or for those that have heard this thing called Q or QAnon, I would encourage you to simply put some preconceptions to the sideline and bench them for just a moment. This particular entity came online 10/28/2017 and immediately began discussing within days and weeks of these initial posts. And it was on a no-name sort of, out of the way website on a forum chat board called 4chan, I believe at the time. But this entity began putting out painstaking and excruciating detail on the levels of real evil in the world, the same subject matter that I had been deeply involved researching online for 6 years. By that particular point, the amount of violence that I've seen on the dark web that no mainstream media or even alternate media up until the last 5 to 7 years has covered is really extreme. And so, looking at what was coming out from this particular entity, my mentor and I in 2018, because I was a little bit late to the party on the drops, we had some very great discussions about how the dynamic, the power, the centers of power in the world, for lack of a better term, had to have undergone some sort of a major colossal shift with the election of President Trump, because this entity online called Q was now publicly disseminating some of the most incredible information about the unifying corruption and the real nature of the corruption that goes on in the world. The same types of information that I unearthed in 2011 and 12 when I first and then got some context with when I first read a book called The Illuminati Bloodlines. So, looking forward from that point until now, we've seen more than 4,960 Q drops that ceased in November, I believe, of 2022. We've not had a new communication from that entity since that time. This particular entity inspired a great deal of what are called the Anons. And so this is where the Anon component of QAnon comes from. I think this was also an extension of controlling the anonymous sector in the world, because the anonymous mindset maybe is the best way to say it, because the mindset behind the anonymous group specifically, and all of those factions aligned with it prior to the inauguration of this entity, was essentially anarchy. But this entity gave a almost like a respectful inclusion of that, the ability to go out and conduct that type of, deep in the night research and look things up and really change the world, while also providing for the acceptance that we really do want to love our country. We really do want to love one another, and we want to respect one another. And we can do so sometimes in the best fashion imaginable, in the best fashion possible, by not putting our faces and our names out there at the forefront. Maybe we allow the content, the detail, the substance of our words and what we bring to the table to prove itself out as to whether or not we are aligned with one another. And so this inspired a whole host of researching and individuals that came out there that took off from these particular online forum boards, researching the subject matter that Q was bringing to the fore, the names that Q named, the images that Q shared from inside the Oval Office, from onboard Air Force One, from ancillary to Air Force One, flying parallel in the sky, images that were sort of inarguable for context and for the credibility gradient of it. And so we've essentially, as a result of that, seen a period of time in the Western world that has now begun to spread really worldwide, where individuals are sort of undertaking the mantra of becoming a digital soldier, or what you could call an Anon. These individuals are folks that have followed online researching for a long time. They're men, women, and children from all over the planet. They're every one of your viewers if they want to be. There is no initiation process to this. The only requirement is that one be willing to have an open mind and accept that the world truly is not as it has seemed. We have been living in a psychological operation, escalating levels of military grade theatrical and psychological warfare for more than 6.5 to 7 decades just in the United States alone. And when we really get down into the machinations of the deep power and control structures around the planet, Veronique, we're going back at least 1,500 to 2,000 years just in its current form. There is a unified corruption out in the world. That corruption is now being exposed. I contend that corruption under the first Trump presidency was engaged militarily by the military forces of the United States because that corruption walked us all of the way to the depopulation cliff. HRC was supposed to be the last salvo out of a 16-year plan, 8 years with President Barack Obama, and then supposedly 8 years with President HRC to plunge humanity into a nuclear holocaust and wipe out most of the free and fair populations around the planet. And so we're in a period of time now where that particular power structure is not only being exposed, but in my opinion, also being kinetically and physically wrestled with. And that particular process, at least according to President Trump, on the 30th of January, 2025, in a press conference at the White House press room, where he stated that the chess game that's being, essentially happening, I believe the exact quote was, "This is a chess game with moves being made at the highest level." This is President Trump telling us in an irregular warfare or an unusual communicative fashion that the war for control of mankind and the destiny of our pulpits and our civilization is not yet over. So that's a very long answer. I sort of wax poetic sometimes with these particular questions. I would beg your audience patience in that regard. There's a lot that goes into the making of my own life and where I come from, a great deal of all this. And there's so much more to know about the nature of the world, Veronique, that many of our brothers and sisters in the world are only now coming around to understand.
Beautiful. Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much, SG, for that extensive introduction and the way you put everything in perspective. Actually, you cover some of the aspect of my first question to you, which were the foreground, the background, the who's, the hows, why this is necessary. And I'm so much appreciative of that which you say. Thank you, which I knew that the only person who can really introduce you is yourself. You went through a lot, and you were made for that, really. The Creator put each one on planet with a purpose, and that is your purpose, which is your passion. Actually, you were passionate to find out what was that HEK 293, and you went in to be able to understand the Q drop and the digital soldier, the psychological warfare that some of the believer or some of the audience may not even understand that we are in the psychological warfare for the past, not even century, millennium. And that is so beautiful. I mean, you break it down. That being said, now we're going to move on into no more covering the part of the rules, the why, the background, because with your introduction, you did it. I'm going to ask you a question. Can you please elaborate on this special operation that you were alluding to early in what President Trump said in his third term? I always call it third term because we know that he was kind of quote unquote behind the scene as a commander-in-chief. So could you please elaborate on this special operation or military covert operation by providing more context on the special military operation, as well as the significance the last 4 years being known as the pause or the dash between the 45 and 47 of the U.S. president?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. This is the other side of the Q coin that is difficult for a lot of people to come around to initially, because while they understand that Q was an entity online that awoke the population to a great deal of criminality and provided painstaking detail, including names, faces, locations, geographic data, familial bloodlines, specific building sites, and things of that nature around the world that were highlighted in both image and textual form. There's a lot of individuals, Veronique, that still are sort of coming around to the idea that Trump is involved with this operation at a very high level in a military or perhaps U.S. executive advisory sense might even be the better way to state it. No one knows who the Q entity online is or where they've come from. If you analyze the type of sentence structures and grammar structures that are put out in the drops, you come back with at least 4 separate individuals. There is a drop that states something along the lines of around the entire world, only 10 people understand the fullness of the plan. Only 3 of them are non-military. When we talk about the plan, and I'm using air quotes to sort of establish a broad umbrella term with that, the plan is multifold, but the 2 main vectors or the 2 main pursuits or objectives in that plan is to awaken mankind to the depth of depravity that's gone on right under their noses so that they might institute safeguards that prevent that depravity from ever happening again, and also to simultaneously undertake the largest hostage rescue mission that's ever been attempted by a coordinated military force. And those operations and missions are still ongoing. Now, what do we mean by hostage rescue? What we mean primarily are those women and children and human beings, not necessarily confined to just the female on the adult side, but certainly more women than men being trafficked, and children of both genders, who have been kidnapped from around the planet by organized cartel mafias. These cartel mafias function across interstate border lines. They are often heavily involved with U.S. and Western intelligence agencies. There's a great deal of money that changes hands for human and child trafficking in particular. Slave labor is one of the main offshoots of that particular industry. Human trafficking eclipsed drugs, I believe, two or 3 years ago as the largest revenue generation black market activity all around the planet. And a great deal of this trafficking, Veronique, happens not for forced labor or for some sort of monetary or pithy gain in the moment, but for religious worship that culminates in Aztec-style human sacrifice. I'm going to let that sink in for your audience there just for a moment. On the Epstein Island, for example, and this is actually mentioned directly in a Q drop, I believe it's drop 1001, which features an aerial overshoot of Epstein's private island. Q references a temple being built on that island. Q references or asks why or what is a temple used for. Q also asks, where do roads lead? So many open-ended questions to get people to sort of think about things. And then Q goes on later in this drop to discuss HRC by name, to discuss something called Table 29, which is a sacrificial altar table for human sacrifice, and then highlights that it's pure evil, so much so that Q closes the drop with the word conspiracy put in sort of sarcastic quotations, because it is so impalpable for most people to understand. It is so difficult to come around to the idea that this type of activity is actually occurring still here in the world in deep hidey holes around the planet, typically in international waters or areas that are sort of in an international jurisdictional sense, which makes it much more difficult to trace people for something called crimes against humanity and violations of genocide conventions and things of that nature, international treaties that would apply inside of ratified nation states. So, I know I'm sort of going off on a tangent. I'll come back here with just a moment. So the militarized component of this ties back to EO 13818. A number of other Trump executive orders allowed for the various bureaucratic machinations of the U.S. government and U.S. military to be freed up to do other, expanded jurisdictional and expanded authoritative operations. But fundamentally, one of the backbones of that entire, construct being set up, at least here in the United States under U.S. law, is Executive Order 13818, which is an executive order that turns serious human rights abuses and corruption into a federal capital crime, and also declares a national emergency with respect to that crime. And a national emergency can be handled, if necessary, by the U.S. military if domestic law enforcement is unable to respond to that particular emergency. And so what we had in the issuance of that order was a blanket thrown over all of the type of criminality that I just referenced a moment ago that previously had not been there and had not been possible. I have photographs on my devices, for example, of Tom Hanks in a prison cell, and I actually have the cell number, but it's difficult to read. I think it's 11B, which is on the picture. I have a number of different photographs of individuals that have been interdicted at some point in time or another by a broader law enforcement operation. I believe the federal government of the United States, under some of their undersecretaries, so like DHS, for example, and DOJ, functioning with deputy prosecutors and undersecretaries and assistant investigators and things of that nature, have been involved in these same types of operations. When we saw the home of Sean Diddy Combs, for example, raided, I believe it was just last year, that raid did not happen by U.S. FBI law enforcement, and it did not happen by state-based law enforcement either. It happened by the Department of Homeland Security, indicating that this was an individual who was involved in activities and criminality that constituted a threat to the national security and national interests of the United States. And so it was handled by an agency empowered to respond in that fashion. The broader component of this, the broader extension of this military operation that I'm referring to with the construct of these various U.S. laws, extends to international coordinated efforts with at least 2 other countries. There's a Q drop that explicitly states, what if Russia and China are coordinating with the President of the United States to eliminate the Nazi world order, the New World Order, the individuals at the top of the occultic line that I just referenced a moment ago, that the top of the occultic practices, so-called philanthropes around the planet who have been involved in enabling the criminality that we've referenced here, with kidnapping at scale, with forced labor, servitude, sacrificing and bloodletting and things of that nature, right? So, fundamentally, all of these different countries have an offering. All of the countries that are involved in this operation, rather, is a better way to say it, have an offering in the plate with respect to what they're going to undertake in their regional sphere of influence. There's a reason that we're seeing earthquakes, for example, beneath the Cayman Islands right now. There's a reason that we've seen U.S. AFRICOM engaged in underground activities in the Horn of Africa for at least the last 60 days. There's a reason that we have a number of deployments of NATO forces that are involved in what I believe to be this broader militarized coalition alliance, training and actually sending multiple divisions and regiments of soldiers into underground systems beneath the Alps, for example. There's an article I've saved from 2018 talking about the Austrian military doing exactly that. In 2019, the U.S. Army spent more than $500 million U.S. training their soldiers to fight in an underground blackout close quarters environment, which is exactly the type of environment that you would need to clean out if you were eradicating underground infrastructure with respect to the movement and smuggling of capital, to include human beings, weapons, drugs, biological material, and others. Russia in Ukraine is another example of an angle on this particular coordinated effort. Russia has published a number of different claims publicly to the world now that they have discovered torture dungeons, sacrificial chambers beneath veterinary and hospital clinics, beneath child's clinics in eastern Ukraine, as well as a very large tunneling network underneath a city called Volchansk. That city is relatively large and it sits on a river, and riverways and waterways are often used as a vector for quiet movement of illegal substances and illegal goods all around the planet. So I know that this is a really long answer, but the question itself was a very large question. What does this operation look like? This operation is multifold. This operation constitutes a breakaway internally, a compartmentalization inside military forces in all of the developed world, because the type of criminality that we're dealing with here, Veronique, is not limited to the civilian domain. It's not limited to its funding at the hands of the central bankers. It's not limited to the human hunting parties undertaken by Lady Gaga and the former Queen of England, now passed. It's not limited to the activities of the $65,000 Obama hot dog party, where many children of both genders were flown into the White House at 2 o'clock in the morning to be abused sexually and presumably physically in other fashions by elected officials in the United States. But it also includes traitors inside the military pulpits of all of the nations involved in the criminal activity. You cannot move this level of illegal material and illegal practices across nation-state boundary lines without alerting at least some of those military forces that are charged with protecting the territorial integrity of those nation states. And so you need individuals, turncoats, those that can be blackmailed, bought off, paid off, or whatever, to be inside those pulpits at very high levels of command and control, so that there is not an interruption to the chain of pain that exists. The wheeling and dealing of criminality that's currently funding a great deal of the black market and being utilized as the vector for some of the most sordid ritualistic behavior imaginable.
All the key players within the movement and within the operation, and I love it how you highlight every facet of the operation for even for a layman to grasp or understand truly what is going on. Why all this executive order, why all this earthquake here, weather manipulation, and this and that, and how the lamestream, I always say the lamestream media, like my president said, the lamestream media, fake news, is still trying to brainwash the people and cause them to be dormant. I really appreciate and absolutely true what you say, that to carry out that level of operation, we need people on board. So this is what is happening behind the scene. Thank you very much, SG. And I don't know whether you saw that last picture, 45-47, which was actually the motorcade of President Trump in his quote-unquote third inauguration. Many people did not understand the dash. They always say, okay, it's 45 and 47. No, that was right there on his motorcade. And people didn't even see it, but that is President Trump himself, his motorcade on January 20, 45-47. It's truly an operation going on. People, you have to pay attention to the little detail, even as SG was saying. The little detail actually well lies or the decode or the breaking of the code. Thank you again, SG, for answering that question extensively. I so much appreciate it. Not only for me, but for the audience, because it will try to give them something to chew on and do their own research. That leads me now into the next question, which is, can people anticipate in the new phase of President Trump, the next with the return of him, what is going on in the movement? Like some people say, if you can control the information or what people heard, you can control what people do. And that's the strategy Rothschild uses to control the world. And I know many people around the world today understand Rothschild. I know exactly where they live, even in Geneva, being a Swiss citizen. So Rothschild, they are the very corrupt Illuminati, whatever family you could name, the 13 blood family, which have to be obliterated out of this world. What will you say, SG?
Well, in fact, the process that you just described, Veronique, is what we've seen playing out certainly over the last 4 years, but I would argue going back to the first Trump administration. You know, we saw one of the most prolific blackmailers and human torture executors in the entirety of our modern era, known as Jeffrey Epstein and his cohort, Ghislaine Maxwell and others, taken down during the first Trump administration. And the level of intelligence, and when we talk about intelligence, we're not talking about intellect, we're talking about actionable information that these types of individuals can provide to both military and civilian law enforcement efforts is sort of invaluable. And I think is one of the reasons we saw Mr. Epstein supposedly killed. We don't really have a good idea of what occurred with that. And we've never had any sort of real transparency on the nature of that death. The coroner records, as I understand it, are pretty much sealed. But that particular type of event has been happening all throughout these last many years, clearly showcasing pressure coming against that broader power structure. The power structure itself is governed by an occultic insular practice within the top chains and echelons of command, right? So in other words, the entirety of the Catholic Church, for example, is not satanic or Luciferian, but the current Pope certainly is. The entirety of various other demographics and groups out there and religions is not anti-human or oriented at enmity with humanity, but the very top echelons and some of the shadow structures that exist within them are. The same is true of the banking world. The same is true of the political world and the political classes. There is a hierarchy. The hierarchy transcends even U.S. presidents and goes all of the way up to royal families. And some of those royal families have intrafamilial hierarchies where they sort of report to one another on an off-book understood chain of command. And so what we now have going on in the world as of 2025 is we have completely flipped the script a great deal of those hierarchies. Many of them have stepped aside. Many of them have simply disappeared from the public life and public view. Many of them have resigned, gone away, taken different jobs, and sort of, disappeared from the awareness. Others have been interdicted with law enforcement efforts that have marred and tarnished their reputations. Others have abdicated the throne, completely unannounced. Queen Margaret of Denmark, for example, about a year ago or just over a year ago, abdicated the throne on live TV with no notice to anyone else in the royal family. You should have seen the shock on all of their faces when this occurred. As I was watching the broadcast, because you could tell that this was the first time that they were hearing this sentiment from the Queen. Looking at the bankers and the Rothschilds that you mentioned just a moment ago, many Rothschild wealth advisory firms and banks have completely shut down. Operational jurisdiction has been denied or revoked to many of them in localities across Europe and certainly here in the Western world. BlackRock is now prevented in at least 10 U.S. states from conducting state-based infrastructurally related financing pertaining to things like giving the state a loan or providing some amount of monies in exchange for land rights or tax breaks or things like that. That particular institution is now completely marred from that. Like I said, and at least I think I said 10, but I think it's 7 different U.S. states at this point. So understanding then that all of this and much more, we could talk about this, for 30 minutes to an hour, probably just on this particular subject of example giving. All of this is our evidence to show that the irregular war that I just sort of highlighted for your audience a moment ago is in fact playing out, and we are in fact winning. There are rally points, battlefield fortresses or forts upon the land, so to speak, to keep with the military metaphor, that we are capturing, repurposing, and controlling for our ends and for our aims. But that does not mean that the chess match is over. It does not mean that the war is won. We still have resistance within inside these pulpits of power around the world, especially in what I call the useful middle class, the mules of the deep state. The godfather of a mafia is never the one pulling the trigger at the street level. That's for all of the useful lower level and mid-level managers who report to captains, who report up the chain all of the way to the very top. And we now are experiencing a lot of the shaking out of that particular street level captain and street level enforcer dynamic and demographic in the form of our elected officials and in many cases our bureaucratic and unelected officials across the entirety of the Western world. The exposure coming to light under Doge, for example, with the U.S. Treasury and the payments being made to foreign terrorist organizations by the State Department. The exposure by State Department whistleblowers of State Department activities seeking to circumvent the new administration. The exposure of U.S. aid, for example, in that, and many, many more. These are all evidence out. This is all evidence out to show that we are moving that needle forward, that we handled the snake by the head first. We chopped off a great deal of the head and made it essentially unfunctionable and unable to issue and control directives and commands and create strategy for the remainder of the mafia. And now we are engaged in a kinetic sort of, almost covert, overt, blended warfare campaign against that very middle class of the mafia. And I expect we, the people, to come around in much larger and greater fashions and in much larger numbers as that particular conflict begins to really turn the screws in the public consciousness with respect to what's happening, most certainly in the United States, but I think by the rest of the world through extension.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you again, SG, for that extensive answer. You made it very clear for the people to understand. And as you alluded earlier about how the Queen of Denmark stepped aside, not only the Queen of Denmark, I remember again in 2017, during the capitulation tour of President Trump, when he walked before the Queen, and how the mainstream media said, oh, he doesn't understand protocol of that. But I'm laughing because that's their purpose, just to brainwash the people and try to put something that is not true. But when you are a decoder like you, SG, and many in the Twitter community, they truly understood that that was a capitulation tour of President Trump, and what was to unfold was what we've seen on during these 4 years, people stepping aside, banking closing, and now we launch with a new, with he's coming back in his third term. Now we see everything, the panic in DC, all the flight that crashing here and there. There's a lot. There's a lot, as you say. We chop out the head of the snake, but there's still some resistance. Thank you again, SG. Do you remember the flight TWA 800 that actually crashes in July 17, 1996? Any similarity with this incident now in DC, Philly, Houston? Sounds like a deja vu. Any thought of that on that, please?
Well, it's fascinating that you should bring that up, Veronique, because the event that we saw happen in Washington, D.C. over the Potomac River, the national waterway of the United States, according to its designation online by the U.S. government, was absolutely rife with symbolism to the point that it's almost sort of palpable and laughable in some ways if it wasn't such a tragedy. And I don't want to minimize or understate the fact that it was a tragedy. And we have to realize, as we the people out there, that this is a warfare campaign that is being conducted by forces interested in the survival and the longevity of humanity, and forces seeking quite literally to kill 90% of humanity and enslave the rest in sort of a human hybrid, robotic, digitized way of life. And that is not an overstatement. I would encourage your audience out there, especially if you're hearing something like that for the first time, to go and look up the various AI agendas that have been talked about openly and publicly by individuals like Yuval Harari and others from the WEF, the WHO, and various UN philanthropic associated groups. Now, with respect to the airplane event that happened over the Potomac River, it happened on the 29th of January. It's worth noting that the occultic group that I highlighted a moment ago, that I've referenced, throughout this process, that's more of an alignment of religious practice rather than a singular group. And I don't want to confuse the audience, right? It's no different than if you had a very large church of all sorts of different individuals from different walks of life doing different things, and they come together periodically for fellowship and worship in the faith and in the divine and deistic practice that they believe is appropriate for them. It is the exact same pattern, conduct of behavior. Pattern of behavior is the best way to say it. For these individuals, but they happen to be worshiping Satan. And we can have a discussion all day about what Satan is or is not, but what is not in question across most of the entirety of the planet is that Satan represents ultimate evil. It represents the absence of God, the absence of love, the void, if you will, of anything good and wholesome and holy. And so, looking at this particular alignment, the 29th of January happens to tie back to a number of different signs. I mentioned symbols. I mentioned table 29 a moment ago from Q Drop 1001. The ancient Phoenician child sacrifice society that existed in the land of Canaan prior to what was later the Israelite occupation and settling of those lands in biblical times. The alphabet used by that particular Phoenician society had 29 letters in it. The current iteration of the devil worship that I'm talking about traces its lineage to at least that far back. It actually goes back further when you look at the Egyptology symbolism behind sacrificing the firstborns, for example, and other things, but we don't have time enough to break down all of the feelers of this particular religious lens on life. But it's worth noting for the audience that the individuals out there that are involved in waging and making war against humanity are doing so because they believe it is their religious duty. They believe it is how they worship their deity to essentially pilfer and destroy God's creation and to destroy, the most innocent among us, which is why I referenced the child component of that a moment ago. Another interesting symbol that comes out of this airline event is the fact that the deep state, the occultic masters, the shadow power structure that exists behind society, whatever you want to call it, for your audience out there as they're attempting to sort of combobulate and form this in their mind. They love using repetitive symbolism. There is a drop taken from the entity online known as Q, stating that their playbook is, quote, known. In other words, we know their playbook. We can see how these things happen and transpire. We can read the pattern now, right? We have the codex, we have the symbol, we have the legend on the map to understand their strategies and their tactics. And so utilizing aerial terrorism is one of their favorite tactics. They've been doing that for a number of decades now. There was an attorney happened to be celebrating her 33rd birthday on that particular flight that crashed, and the airline flight that was landing, the American Eagle airline flight that was landing on runway 33. Now, 33 is also a tie back to Freemasonry, which is one of those pulpits of hidden Satanism that I mentioned a moment ago. Most Freemasons are perfectly decent people and would have a hard time coming around to that type of realization. But the 32nd and 33rd degree Masons across the Scottish Rite often have knowledge of extraordinarily dark activities or are themselves participating in those extraordinarily dark activities. And so this is another symbolism overlap that actually ties back all of the way to the Bavarian Illuminati of the mid 18th century. Now, here's where it gets really weird, Veronique. Just a couple of days after this particular event that occurred over the Potomac River, we saw the country of Somalia struck by U.S. airstrikes. Somalia also happens to be the country in Africa that was involved under the Clinton administration with an event that later inspired the movie and the book Black Hawk Down. 18 U.S. soldiers were killed in an ambush in Mogadishu under President Clinton's directive to go into Mogadishu and essentially assist in humanitarian relief supplies, and special operators were also ordered to conduct an assassination of one of the oppositional forces on the ground in that area. U.S. forces suffered pretty significant losses that day, 18 dead, more than 70 wounded, and it actually forced President Clinton. It was such a scandal publicly that it forced President Clinton to withhold authorization for any additional U.S. troops to be committed to that situation in Somalia. Again, I believe this was 1993. It may have been 1994. Don't quote me on the exact year. And so now we have this particular a helicopter striking this aircraft over the Potomac River, and it's a Black Hawk helicopter striking an American Eagle jet. And President Clinton's Secret Service code name when he was in the office of the presidency was Eagle. So looking at this particular landscape that's playing out, again, with the irregular warfare lens, with the message in the message lens, we can see that this is evidence to show that we are making literal back and forth moves. We're making kinetic moves and counter moves on a game board that is affecting we the people in a kinetic and real world fashion, but it's sort of an openly undeclared war. On the 30th of January, just one day before those Somali airstrikes and just one day after this plane crash that we're talking about, President Trump gave a press conference where he stated that these are chess moves being made at the highest level. I think he said this is a chess game with moves being made at the highest level is the exact quote. So this was a reference clearly to tell us that there is a struggle, if you will, a back and forth that's happening inside the real control structures of government, of society here in the Western world and around the planet. And that particular struggle and that particular chess match, for lack of a better metaphor here, is ongoing and is not over.
Wow. That's what I call, let's take a deep breath. A lot. The Clinton involvement in the deep state is really rooted so deep, deeper than even, I think we had a last show last week with Kathy O'Brien. She was talking about how she was sexually abused by the Clinton and the Bohemian Grave and all that. That is really deep. And you have done the parallel with between the flight and the Somalian Black Hawk, that movie, the Mogadishu. That's deep. Wow. People, we need to wake up.
It is truly incredible, Veronique.
Yeah, it's very incredible.
And one of the things to keep in mind when we talk about exposure and we talk about sort of divining a little bit of the irregular warfare symbolism, or interpreting and deliberating and decoding it, maybe is the better way to say it, out there in the world, is we have to keep in mind that those operations for exposure are going in both directions, but that there is now a unilateral pressure, or a multilateral pressure is the better way to explain it, being applied to this very deep state apparatus from all of these different actors around the world. There is a reason, for example, that Russia is heavily involved in the surface machinations and in the surface geopolitical events and scenarios that are playing out on the African continent, the immediate sub-Saharan African continent, essentially providing the buffer, if you will, the breaking of the fall for these nations to finally disconnect from the Western post-colonial arm of enslavement, which is essentially functioned through USAID, various other State Department NGOs and agencies, and of course the U.S. military having an influence across the entirety of the African and Middle Eastern regions. And at the same time that Russia is providing grain and military support and resource support that was lost when these nations disconnected from Washington, D.C., we have the American military in the form of Africa Command making contact with local governments across the sub-Saharan and sub-Nile Delta African continent, specifically in the Horn of Africa in recent weeks and months, establishing security guidelines and dynamic cooperative arrangements to allow for cross-border militarized operations to be occurring. And so what is happening now is you can never trust the cat to clean up its own nest, so to speak, when it's been the one causing the problem. So you bring the dog in from next door. And that's exactly what we've been seeing happening in the Horn of Africa and is currently playing out in Somaliland right before our eyes.
Wow. Wow. Very interesting. Thank you. Thank you again, SG. Moving on, we have heard a lot of allegations about DC Inc. Incorporation. Some say it's no longer in charge. It sure looks like defunct. Others state President Trump is standing on the Constitution and laws of the Republic. And we, the people, need to learn how about what the law of the land really entails. What are your thoughts or your view on that one? Or how can you better explain to our audience why no more DC Incorporation, District of Columbia? In fact, I was looking on the map. I just saw Washington. I couldn't see any longer the DC. Google have removed it. I don't know, from January, something like that. Is he already telling us that it's truly different?
Well, this is part of the irregular warfare messaging that I would submit to the world, is letting us know that we've had serious societal level changes that have happened in the background of the operations of the U.S. government structure, for example, and various private and public sector institutions, that is only now beginning to come out into the foreground. I have video footage stored on my archive devices of the IRS and Federal Reserve building, for example, here in the United States, completely boarded up. And I don't mean boarded up for construction. I mean boarded up, fenced off, closed for business. And at least one of those videos, there's police tape all over the main entryway. I believe it's to the IRS building. So the corporate jurisdiction that you referenced a moment ago is yet another layer of the military-grade psychological warfare that has been played out against we the people of the world for a very long time. We in the United States of America were raised to believe that we've inherited a republic. A republic is referenced in our Pledge of Allegiance. A republic is referenced in all of our founding documents. The extensiveness and the privileges and the actual permissions and authorities of that very republic are referenced pretty much extensively and to a great degree in something called the Federalist Papers, going back to the early days of the United States of America. And so for a long time, the American system itself, from 1789 to approximately 1860, around the U.S. Civil War, functioned as what is called a common law representative republic. In other words, a republic is a broader national union with a lot of semi-autonomous states that are within that union. Federal jurisdiction and federal control is curtailed to the greatest degree possible, making allowances for something like interstate commerce, for example, levying a tax of commerce upon the interstate transactional activities between the union, having a central treasury to be able to pay for things like the military forces of the nation, which provide for the national defense and protect the territorial borders. And most of the rest of the authorities and privileges under a true Republican system are left to the states for them to decide. And there's very little recourse, even in federal courts of law, and even under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court of the United States, where the federal government is truly able to tell the states what to do or how they're going to act or behave. under that Republican system, again, with limited exception, primarily concerned toward the national defense and the levying of interstate taxes. What we saw, however, as a result of the U.S. Civil War was an abandonment of that republic. What occurred under President Lincoln was that the southern states left the Union, essentially stopped showing up to Congress, declared themselves to be a free and independent nation. And so what happened then as a result of that is there was no longer a quorum or a required number of states to convene in order to administrate and adjudicate the business of the Union. So the Union itself essentially nearly collapsed. President Lincoln made the choice to move a number of the seats that remained inhabited in Congress, as well as all of the seats that were now uninhabited and abandoned in Congress, into an executive government format where the executive would essentially control and babysit those states and the responsibility for making decisions on behalf of those states while the Civil War itself was prosecuted. And it was an event that very nearly tore America apart and killed more than 640,000 of our young men, women, and children. So on the other side of that particular war, the debt, the indebtedness that was accrued as a result of the war's activities was so great that the Congress that met on behalf of the salvaged Union, I believe it was in 1868 or 1869, requested a loan and accepted a loan from the Rothschild family specifically and from other Western European central bankers as a result to pay for the war. And when they defaulted on the interest payments for the loans that were given as a result of that in 1870, the discussion was had with then President Ulysses Grant that either the United States of America could incorporate and go from being a republic to a corporation, or the pieces and parts of the country, territorially speaking, would be sold off by those bankers in lieu of the debt payments that were owed. So in other words, it's sort of like you owe a debt to me, you guarantee that debt with collateral, you don't pay that debt, now the collateral is mine to do with it what I will. That was the exact discussion that happened at the nation state level, which pinned President Grant pretty much against a wall. The decision was made to incorporate the United States to preserve the Union. And in the Organic Act of Columbia of 1871, that incorporation was codified in U.S. Code. I forget the exact statute number, but it's in the Federal Register, and people can go and look that up. In the following few years after that, all of the states incorporated themselves, and then trickling down through the years, by 1900, the early 1900s, we saw all of the counties within most of the states, most of the counties within the states incorporated as well. So you had essentially a business entity now from the top down acting as the de facto government of a territory. In other words, a business has quite literally been impersonating a lawful government for over 150 years here in the United States of America. Now, what happens inside of a corporation? Well, you don't get rights in a corporation, you get policies. A corporation cannot make laws, but a corporation can make orders. A corporation cannot institute new legislation into its own right, but a corporation can legislate its own internal bylaws. We've seen the Supreme Court of the United States, all of the judiciary incorporated. I have the corporation numbers for most of the federal government agencies, including the Department of Defense. I have a number of corporation numbers from the community that I live in. You can trace them all back on DunandBradstreet.com and find the corporation number for your particular town, locality, or community. If you're a U.S. watcher watching this broadcast, in just a few minutes, you have to be willing to, put together a little bit of, put forth a little bit of effort and digging. It's not immediately accessible on the first page of Google, so to speak, but it is relatively easy to find with a few minutes and a hot cup of coffee. And you'd be surprised what you would find out there. And so now, fasting forward all of the way to 2017, we saw the Office of Military Settlements issue a more than $21 trillion check to pay off the balance of debt owed by the American people as a result of the corporation's activities to the international community. In other words, we are paying off the debt of the American people, and we're going to do something different with this corporation. And the very next year, in 2018, President Donald Trump began the bankruptcy process of the U.S. corporate government. When that process began, we saw, to utilize the terminology, Veronique, all hell break loose with respect to the domestic landscape in the United States. The election cheating ramped way up. We saw an acceleration towards the depopulation agenda, which was inaugurated in December of 2019, January of 2020, called COVID-19. Essentially, everyone acting inside of that corporate tyrannical structure realized that the jig was going to eventually be up. And so they were now up against the clock for pushing out their agenda as quickly and as doggedly and as determinedly as they possibly could. And we are still living through the ongoing bankruptcy, insolvency, and receivership process of that corporation now.
Wow. That's beautiful. What a great time to be alive. 150 years people have waited to see what is going on today. Wow. And I like the fact that you mentioned exactly how it went from the Republic to the incorporation. And without even mention the creator of the Jackie Island, happened to live very close to this, I don't know whether the producer can bring it, happened to live very close to the island where the creator of Jackie Island, which is the Federal Reserve, was when they have their first meeting and all that. Wow. The book has almost 680 pages talking about how they actually create the Federal Reserve. The IRS, both are unconstitutional for the people of the Republic. And that is, again, something that the bloodline, the Rothschild, the Rockefeller, or the big pharma people, they try to bring on the US soil to enslave not only US people, but worldwide, because the, how you call it, the EMF, the world banking system, with a seed in Zurich, Switzerland, but also in Washington, D.C. That's beautiful. The three states, the London state, the Washington state, D.C., and then the Vatican. Wow. I'm so happy that you break down all the pieces for the people to understand truly why this not only was necessary, but why it's pivotal for us, such a time as this, living on the planet Earth. Thank you again, SG. Thank you. And as you mentioned, I don't know whether we still have a little time, whether we could cover the NESARA and GESARA, which is the National Economic Security and Recovery Act, and GESARA, which is the Global Economic Security and Recovery Act. How this will play out, and why do we still have to wait for that to come up? I understand that President Trump, almost during all his rally, he was saying, okay, how about cutting the taxes? How about reducing how about bringing the tariff? How about this? How about that? Is that somehow an indication for we the people that it is already implemented? NESARA and GESARA? Thank you.
Well, it's very interesting, Veronique, and I have to admit this is probably a fantastic question to begin a closing segment with, because it speaks to the truth, and it speaks to a great deal of the interest, I guess, behind a lot of what has occurred here in the world. When we talk about, the crime of usury, for example, that is exactly the situation that we just described a moment ago. When someone impersonates someone else and then utilizes the substance of whomever they are impersonating to transact business and commerce, to willfully plunder their wealth and provide that gain for themselves, that is the definition of usury, and it's also the definition of piracy. And so when we look at what has happened here in the world, the concept of NESARA GESARA first began under the late 1990s. There was a group of about 400 different military personnel from all across the United States Fleet Military Forces who were aware of what had been going on for a number of decades, who had a plan in mind to try and augment and flip the system and take power away from those dark occultic masters who had corporatized the United States and really ruined the rest of the planet by extension. We could spend an entire broadcast discussing what the military-industrial complex of the U.S. did to the planet during the 20th century. And they devised a plan to take away the power of money specifically. In other words, to put money literally and in an intangible, esoteric way back into the hands and control of the people. If we could, accelerate or lift up, elevate is the word I'm looking for, people of the United States and of the Western world nations and worldwide markets out of poverty and into a dynamic with one another where the exchange of value could occur in very large scale, could occur very frequently. Eventually, that would root out the entirety of the infestation. This was sort of the plan strategized and characterized by those military personnel I referenced a moment ago. 9/11/2001 was the response to this plan. And that response, unfortunately, plunged the world into more than 20 years of war, cost millions of lives, and decimated at least 7 different countries, really 8 if you count Ukraine by this particular point in time. And so the period from 2017 to now was the reattempt at such a plan, but with a much broader objective and a much different landscape at play. It wasn't going to be this time around as front-facing, as patently obvious as a re-injection into the system of a new financial way of life, which was lined up for September of 2001. Actually, the announcement was being readied by Alan Greenspan, who never made it onto air in order to give that particular announcement. And so what we've seen as a result of the last 8 years is a number of different things to show that the spirit of that particular strategy, the ethos, if you will, of Nasara and Jassara, which is essentially global fair trade and unity with one another, a return to constitutional law here in the United States of America, and a fair and just tax system. That ethos has been playing out not only in the U.S., but around the rest of the planet for a long time. We have the development now of the desire for no income tax here in the United States, which is reigniting the discussion around the fact that the income tax was already adjudicated by the Supreme Court, not the Republic Supreme Court, but the corporate Supreme Court in 1895, I believe as Farmers Loan and Trust versus U.S., essentially stating that the income tax itself is an unconstitutional levy upon the life force, the life gainfulness of the human being, and you cannot do that. We've seen the discussion about tariffs, right? President McKinley in U.S. history was assassinated because he was utilizing tariffs to offset the corporatized control of the United States of America. He was essentially trying to get control back into the hands of we the people by alleviating the landscape that was coming as a result of new regulations and new fiscal policy of the government of the day, and they removed him for it. We've seen a number of different things playing out over these last few years going forward from 2018, essentially, to show that a rebalancing of our financial way of life and the way that we exchange value with one another is absolutely going on, but it is going on very gradually. If you were to re-inject, for example, wealth that had been fleeced from more than 3 generations of people, the quantity of that wealth would be so enormous that it would destroy the economic landscape that currently exists. Nobody would go to work the next day because most people that are working in the present day and time are in a situation or in a field or a discipline or a pursuit or a practice that they do not care much for, that they happen to be very skilled at and very good at, but they wish that they had more time to pursue creative pursuits that are more interesting and really more of a priority for their own personal happiness. And if they were to suddenly inherit $250,000 from the U.S. Treasury, they would do exactly that and tell their workplace to see you. So in this particular landscape that we're going through, this process that we're going through, and the landscape that's shaping up is maybe a better way to say it, we have the entirety of a system that has been fleecing the populations of not only the U.S., but the rest of the world by extension, being reoriented in a junction-by-junction fashion to allow for a gradual changeover into a better way of life. I'm anticipating that this pathway in the U.S. will likely play out as a meteoric rise in wages relative to the actual day-to-day costs of living. If you could purchase, in a hypothetical scenario, a $50,000 home while making $24 an hour for relatively skilled labor, or we'll say medium-term entry-level skilled labor, $34 to $44 an hour, again in this hypothetical, for significant or educated skilled labor, you would have a disparity on behalf of we the people, in the favor of we the people, right? A gap between cost of living and actual earnings coming in that would allow for economic activity to occur more frequently and more freely. It would allow for a greater pleasantry of life throughout the entirety of the land. It would allow for easier property acquisition. It would allow for a number of different things that would begin to lower the crime rate. All crime is as a result of someone or someone's needing something from someone else. And so if you remove or mitigate that need to the greatest extent possible, then you would essentially achieve a landscape, where the willfulness to participate in negative activities that are detrimental to all of the security of we the people and our own personal happiness and pursuit of happiness here in the world would simply not stand up for very long. And so I'm looking at what we have playing out in the world now under President Trump as the first opening salvos of exactly that. We're talking about tariffs around the rest of the planet that will encourage other nations to put reciprocal tariffs, as they should, on goods and services and resources that only they can offer and bring to the international table. The idea is to restore fair and just value exchange and constitutional law as to the greatest degree possible inside the U.S., so that the rest of the planet can do the exact same in a culturally significant and meaningful way for their own nations.
Exactly. Thank you. Thank you very much, SG, for answering that question extensively, and of course the people to understand the meaning behind Nesara, Jusara, and what is necessary. Thank you very much. We are so much appreciative of your time. We know that you are in high demand, and I'm going to short out the interview by just quickly ask you this last question. If you may please answer, and also with the same token, give us your social media handle where people could find you. I know that you have a lot, but please, again, you have to especially tell the people where they can find you. Catherine Edridge, Emmy-winning investigative journalist, have made quite a few trips back and forth in Guantanamo Bay. What is going on there? Are we now witnessing justice be served for the perpetrator?
Well, that's a fascinating question to conclude with, Ms. Veronique, and I would say that particular scenario has yet to be fully determined. But what we have are indications from Ms. Harridge, who also happens to be mentioned directly by the entity called Q, that we have a phase of public justice that we are entering into, which by the time it concludes and by the time we arrive at sort of the climactic portion of that phase, we will have the American population, as well as a number of population groups across the Western world, asking for military justice for levels of treason and sedition against the Republic and against their fellow we the peoples that are difficult to describe and qualify here. We've talked about a lot of dark criminality here today. To wax too long on that seems a little bit of a disservice to your audience, but suffice to say, there are levels of criminality that have been committed for a very long time, and even up through the present day here in the United States, against we the peoples in all of our Western world population groups, but especially in the United States, that constitute themselves as war crimes. And so those particular levels of criminality are not fit for a civilian court, because no punishment is really great enough, and the process itself in civilian court is designed to, allow for the greatest amount of time to pass before a sentence truly comes down, which is both itself a blessing and a curse when you have individuals being accused by their fellow man in a court of common law, of a particular crime. A delay in that process or a slowness to that process allows the truth to float to the surface and guarantees to the greatest degree possible that we have the correct verdict at the end of whatever proceeding happens to be inaugurated. But when we talk about war crimes, military crimes, crimes of genocide, crimes of mass murder, crimes against humanity is another terminology you could utilize to class that particular level. You're talking about inarguable activities that are patently apparent on their face and have to be handled in a military court, because a military court is designed to hear out as much evidence and provide as much evidence as they can towards the conclusion of that process, and then expeditiously hand down a sentence to move on to the next individual or individuals that perhaps stand to be accused of those same crimes. I find it absolutely fascinating that in Ms. Harridge's videos that she's put out on her public-facing X profile from Guantanamo Bay's Camp Justice, which is worth noting that that's the camp she's been at, every single one of those videos has so far mentioned a 17. and Q is the 17th letter of the alphabet. And it's worth noting that symbolism is a powerful component of what's actually happening here. These opponents that we have faced, our deep state conquistadors, for lack of a better term, have utilized symbolism against us for hundreds and hundreds of years. They've put it right in our face. They've put it all over their buildings. It's all over their books. It's in their movies. It's on their ledges. It's on their bridges. It's contained within their oaths in some regards. It's plastered on the sides of religious artifacts. It's literally all over the place. And so symbolism itself is now being utilized by what I believe to be a patriotic, humanity-focused group of individuals in both military and civilian landscapes to push back on that particular deep state, power structure, that concentrated apparatus of control, and actually use that symbolism against them in the adjudication process for levels of criminality, Veronique, that again are very hard to describe and get into full detail without doing a disservice to the audience. With respect to my particular channels and social media presences, I can be found online in 4 separate places. I'm on rumble.com at the handle rumble.com/user/QNewsPatriot. I am not on Rumble by the name SG Anon, although there are copycat channels of my presence on the Rumble platform. I can also be found on President Trump's Truth Social platform at the handle Real, REAL SG Anon with a red check mark. I can be found on X, formerly Twitter, at the handle THE QNewsPatriot with a blue check mark. And I can be found on Telegram now at the authentic channel t.me/real, REAL QNewsPatriot.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you very much, SG, for your time and all the information in detail that you have given today to our audience. And we know that you're about to jump to another show, coming from one to this one and go to other. We're so much appreciative of your time, and we thank you again. And we know that is not your last time, because we would like our audience to know more about this operation, what to expect, what they see out, how to now navigate to the current and understand everything. So that being said, I'm going to be closing, and then that will be the end of the show today. Beloved, this plan that is in operation has been working on a various level for many years. In complex beyond our ability to put all parts of it together. So even nearly figure it out. Certainly some of the things will disturb and puzzle us, while others go down as we expected. And we applaud them. With some remain undercover simultaneously, others have been done on hard to stomach, but necessary. In my humble opinion, I like to call it an art of war. Immutably, God knows, He sees, He reigns, and nothing will be done that will keep His good and perfect will to come to be. So I thank you again. Thank you, and thank you for the privilege of your time today. I am Veronique Lawson, coming to you live on Mamlakak Broadcast Network. Thank you, and bye-bye.